During the summer of 2020, I found myself with a lot more time to spend quilting, but the quilting community as a whole was confronting many of the issues the rest of the country was grappling with. Things were changing rapidly, and I soon began to see and understand quilting as a medium with a mission and use beyond comfort and warmth. That understanding, it turns out, is a fundamental part of art literacy. According to the National Coalition for Core Arts Standards, becoming art literate involves understanding the art form and then participating in that art form in an authentic way. For our purposes, we're going to seek to understand quilting as an art form, art as a tool for social justice advocacy, and quilts as a medium through which we can work towards social justice and critically analyze our own implicit biases, privilege, and participation in systemic inequities. As a quilter myself, I have long understood that quilts involve a high degree of artistry and craftsmanship. Some of the most used and loved quilts are beautiful, interesting works of art. But there's a whole category of quilts that are never meant to be used and that are constructed and designed specifically to be hung on the wall. Unsurprisingly, these are called art quilts. But just because something can be hung on the wall doesn't necessarily make it art. So let's take some time to think about this essential question. Are quilts art? The Art Institute of Chicago thinks so. In 2020, the Art Institute hosted the first solo museum exhibition of Bisa Butler's work. In a February 18, 2021 article for the Chicago Tribune titled, "At the Art Institute, Bisa Butler's quilted portraits depict Black figures in a new light," Butler is quoted as saying, quote, "All of the newspaper headlines say Van Gogh, Monet, and Bisa Butler. I can't be mad at that lineup," end quote. In this video clip from CBS This Morning on September 4th, 2021, we hear more from Butler about quilts as art.
Her vividly detailed portraits often reimagine the lives of those they portray. And now Bisa Butler's life itself is launching in a new direction.
Seeing my artwork at home and in my studio is one thing, but seeing it in this location is just completely mind-blowing.
Just 4 years past her career as a high school art teacher, Butler has unveiled her first show at a major museum. And it's at one of the world's most renowned, the Art Institute of Chicago. How would you describe your art?
When I first started making quilts, they were not considered fine art. They were considered craft. I call my work now portrait quilts.
Every fiber of her life-size portraits is imbued with meaning, from patterned African fabrics themselves to how they're patched together.
I think that historically, quilt work, craft work had been marginalized because it was the work of women and it was the work of people of color. It was considered like a domestic labor.
Quilts are art according to the Minneapolis Institute of Art as well. In 2021, the museum exhibited the work of Lamerchi Frazier as part of a larger initiative called We Are the Story, in partnership with the Textile Center and housed in art spaces throughout the Twin Cities. Carolyn Mazlumi, a seminal figure in the art quilting movement, developed We Are the Story in response to the national focus on Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd. In the article, artist Lamerchi Frazier's quilt expresses the bond of a mother and child in thread. Art journalist Maria Vogel worked with Carleen Gardner, the director of the Minneapolis Art Institute of Arts Center for Empathy and the Visual Arts, to analyze one of the quilts in Frazier's exhibition. They specifically discuss the significance of the quilting as the artistic medium, saying, quote, "The material Frazier used to create the work adds another layer to its empathetic connection with viewers. Quilts, which suggest warmth, domestic life, and stability, are also intimately tied to African-American art-making traditions. The materiality lends itself to a feeling of comfort and protection. Looking at it, you can imagine its feel and sense the reassurance of security," end quote. Vogel and Gardner go on to draw comparisons to Da Vinci, Titian, and Raphael, three of the most lauded artists in recorded history. The Baltimore Museum of Art joins Chicago and Minneapolis in their treatment of quilts as art. BMA's exhibit, She Knew Where She Was Going, G's Ben Quilts and Civil Rights, wasn't just another quilt exhibit. It explored G's Ben quilts as works of art, tradition, and history, yes, but it also detailed the formation of the Freedom Quilting Bee in 1966, following Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit to G's Ben in the same year. The Freedom Quilting Bee sought to empower G's Ben quilters and to enfranchise their work through representation in prestigious art auctions, commercial partnerships, and museum exhibitions like those detailed in this presentation. They sought out credibility in the art world and as an art form, and their work resulted in permanent positive changes to the local economy and the financial security of the quilters. The Baltimore Museum of Art, in a true putting their money where their mouth is moment, acquired 5 G's Ben quilts using a portion of their $2.5 million annual acquisition budget. The quilts will be exhibited as part of the museum's permanent American art collection. Chad Scott, in the article Bisa Butler Exhibition at Art Institute of Chicago, headlines National Recognition of Quilting, published on April 8th, 2021 on Forbes.com, states that, quote, across the nation, an unprecedented consideration of quilting has now placed this medium on an equal footing with what has always been considered fine art. Any museum visit henceforth which doesn't feature quilts in one form or another will seem lacking, end quote. Bisa Butler, in the same article, shares that early critics of her work believed she was, quote, using fibers as a crutch to cover up unskilled artistic expression, end quote, and that her quilts didn't have a clear place in serious art. Now she says, quote, people are starting to realize that the quilts that their grandmothers and aunties made are worthwhile, and they need to set those aside and preserve them, end quote. American documentarian Ken Burns is a longtime avid quilt collector. In this clip from the documentary series Craft in America, Burns concludes our conversation about quilts as art with a succinct and shared definition of both.
This is what human beings are required to do, to take raw materials and transform them into something greater than the sum of their parts. And that's what a quilt is, that's what art is. And
art has a long, vibrant history as a tool in local, national, and international struggles for social justice. The questions of what constitutes protest art or political art or simply art with a social message are as complex and convoluted as those focused on quilts as art. Still, in an effort to understand these questions and the art that works to answer them is a central tenet of art literacy. So we will explore protest art more closely over the next few slides. The image shown here was created by artist Aaron Harvey in 2008 as a campaign image to promote a no vote on Prop 8. Proposition 8, a California constitutional amendment that removed the right to marry from same-sex couples, was passed in 2008, setting off months of protests. Prop 8 was ultimately ruled unconstitutional and overturned in 2010, but it did not go into effect until 2013. In 1937, Pablo Picasso created Guernica for the Spanish Pavilion at the International Exposition in Paris. The painting, over 11 feet tall and nearly 26 feet wide, was Picasso's response to the German bombing of a small town in Basque. Scholars and historians, unable to identify specific allusions to the event in studies or the finished painting, instead theorize that the work is meant to be understood as commentary on the Spanish Civil War and foreshadowing of World War II. According to Rethinking Guernica, a web-based research project conducted by the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofia, over time, quote, Guernica became a political symbol to such a degree that it appears as an emblem in any episode of violence or the vulnerability of civilians, end quote. In 1987, at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the US, 6 New York City men conceived of a poster that would eventually become one of the most well-known symbols of AIDS, HIV advocacy and activism. The pink triangle was turned upside down and used in Nazi Germany to identify homosexual men. Here it is right side up, and the text in the image was intentionally sparse. Avram Finkelstein, one of the 6 creating artists, wrote of the power of protest posters as an art form. He said, quote, the poster perfectly suits the American ear. It has a power. If you've ever stopped in front of one or turned your head for a second look, that power was at work. You may barely have been aware of it because of its hammer and nail simplicity, but you were caught up in it just the same. It's not art if art is for museums. It's far more robust than that. It comes for you in ways art simply can't. The poster comes from you for you where you live, end quote. Shepard Fairey, in collaboration with Ernesto Urena and Jessica Sabagal, funded by the Amplifier Foundation and a hugely successful Kickstarter campaign, created a series of We the People posters and had them printed in newspapers around the country for protesters to carry at inauguration protest rallies and the Women's March in 2017. In an LA Times article published on January 20th, 2017, Ferry told journalist Jessica Gelt that his hope for the iconic Obama hope image and for these posters was one and the same, quote, to provide encouragement to those who feel powerless and deflated, end quote. And collaborating artist Jessica Sabagal, in an interview with NBC News, extended this encouragement to instigate action, saying, quote, art is what shapes movements. It's our catharsis, our call to action. But in the end, social change must come from people working together to change our economic and political system, end quote. More recently, cities throughout the US have been wrestling with how to move forward, theoretically and practically, after the murder of George Floyd and the protests that followed. Lisa Kelly, a Minneapolis activist, as well as activists in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, are repurposing plywood from boarded up windows as art with social justice roots and branches.
The sheets of plywood placed over storefronts in cities across the country during the protests of last year were meant to protect against property destruction. But they served another unexpected purpose as well, as blank pages where the history of a moment in American history was recorded. NBC's Kathy Park explains in our Sunday Spotlight.
As the fallout from George Floyd's murder flared through city streets in the summer of 2020, plywood began going up out of fear and uncertainty.
I think of all of the visual cues that we will remember from that time, there would probably be masks and plywood.
Boarded up businesses opening a wave of emotions as the plywood became the public's canvas.
This is people's expression of grief and trauma.
Minneapolis resident turned activist Lisa Kelly says she was gripped by the movement and felt compelled to take action.
What types of emotions surfaced for you at that time?
For me, I just kind of shut down completely. I'd go to these protests almost robotically, and then I'd go home, wrap myself in a blanket, and cry myself to sleep. And so when the boards started to show up around the Twin Cities and we drive down, a major street and see all of these incredible murals that spoke so clearly and profoundly to the emotions that I wasn't able to express, I just knew that something had to happen.
Rather than watch the murals fade away, Kelly was on a mission to preserve the plywood. Nearly 900 of them are now part of an evolving exhibit through Memorialize the Movement, founded by Kelly and a team of volunteers.
Some people might say, this is just plywood. Why preserve it?
It's not just plywood, and it's not even just art, it's recorded history.
In cities across the country, discarded plywood is seeing a second life. In Chicago, Boards of Change salvaged the signs to create registration booths ahead of last year's election. Worthless Studios in New York City selected artists through an open call, empowering them with plywood sourced from businesses and even the Empire State Building. All 5 boroughs in New York became the backdrop for the artwork.
The idea really here is, with the title Be Heard, is for people to engage with the sculpture and feel that they have a platform to amplify their voice, and also as a hearing mechanism to listen to the city and to listen to what other people have to say as well.
That message showcasing the many dimensions of a movement that surfaced out of protest, now protected for future generations.
With other civil rights movements, you might have picket signs or photographs or like a shoe or something that you can take and put in a museum as an artifact. But this is the first time art has also been artifact. And I'm just so proud to be here with it and to be a part of this movement.
For Sunday Today, Kathy Park, Minneapolis, Minnesota.
The Robert E. Lee Memorial in Richmond, Virginia, built in 1890, has been a recent site of Black Lives Matter protests and rallies and heated debate about the racist origins of monuments overall. It has also been a canvas for artist Dustin Klein. Klein, over the span of 3 months in the summer of 2020, used the enormous base of the statue of Lee astride a horse to project images and videos of Black citizens killed by police and historic Black men and women who have shaped the history of the US. The projection images have included Nina Simone, Malcolm X, George Floyd, Harriet Tubman, John Lewis, and Breonna Taylor. Klein, when asked by art historian Jessica Stewart about the public's response to the projections for a July 28, 2020 article on My Modern Met, said simply, quote, many Black people who have said they've never thought about stepping foot on the grounds of the Lee Monument now feel that the space is reclaimed, end quote. It was announced today, September 8th, 2021, that the statue will be removed after a ruling from the Supreme Court of Virginia and following months of litigation. Quilting, too, has been an important medium in social justice movements, particularly for women who often could not participate or engage in more masculine or public-facing ways. Carolyn Mazlumi theorizes that it is the medium itself that makes quilting particularly effective as a tool in social justice work. In Quilt Making for Social Justice, published in the November-December 2020 issue of Resurgence and Ecologist, Mazlumi says that, quote, quilts as visual media pose an alternative and non-threatening approach to topics of social issues, end quote. She continues, quote, quilts and quilt making are especially important to African-American culture because the art form was historically one of the few mediums accessible to marginalized groups to tell their own story, to provide warmth for their families, and to empower them with a voice, end quote. Devana Robidi, a program director at the Schweinfurth Art Center in Auburn, New York, echoes this statement when speaking about Sean Kimbert, the quilter who made the quilt you see here. Robidi says, quote, I like how she turned that item of comfort and safety and something you would use to be sheltered and feel warm. But you know, it changes when you put that statement on it, end quote. Kimber's quilt is titled The One for Eric G. and was made in 2015, not in 2020, as you may have expected at first glance. Queen Liliuokalani, the last sovereign monarch of the Hawaiian kingdom, was imprisoned in Iolani Palace in Honolulu, Hawaii for 8 months in 1895. The sentence came after a coup d'etat led by European and American citizens and backed by the US government and aided by the US military. While imprisoned, the queen made what has become known as the Queen's Quilt, which documented her life and carried subversively stitched symbols of the monarchy, aloha aine, Hawaiian patriotism, and the Hawaiian flag, which had recently been banned. It was widely considered one of the first overtly political quilts and an exquisite example of embroidery and the traditional American crazy quilt style. This is a more contemporary take on quilted commentary on incarceration. California quilter Karen Maple wrote in her artist statement for this piece, the United States incarcerates 3.5 times the number of people than European countries. People of color have a much higher imprisonment rates than whites in the US. Regardless of color or economic background, many prisoners are forgotten by society and spend countless hours alone in their cells with nothing to do. How would you spend your years in prison in orange garb? End quote. If you did not grow up with quilts as part of your family tradition, as was the case for me, perhaps your first exposure to them was through the NAMES Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. Cleve Jones planted the first seeds for the project during the candlelight vigil for murdered San Francisco Supervisor Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone. The quilt is made of 3-foot by 6-foot panels, which represents the average size of a casket. Each panel bears the name of a single life lost to AIDS-related complications. To date, there are over 105,000 names in the quilt, which is currently under the stewardship of the National AIDS Memorial. Many projects have been inspired by the NAMES Project, including the one pictured here. The monument quilt features a collection of over 3,000 stories of sexual assault and domestic violence written, painted, and stitched into red fabric by survivors and allies. There is impact, of course, in the individual blocks seen here on the right, but the size and scope of the full quilt, like the NAMES Project quilt, is truly startling. The community aspect of social justice quilting, as we have seen here, is particularly important to both the art form and for our purposes. Sarah Trail, a Berkeley and Harvard educated activist, educator, and quilter, created this quilt titled Rest in Power Trayvon when she was just 17 years old, the same age Trayvon was when he was killed. The quilt was not well received by the quilting community at the time, but Trail saw that resistance to the message and conversation as an opportunity to change the false narrative of quilting as a neutral, apolitical women's hobby. She founded the Social Justice Sewing Academy, which uses a workshop push-in model to work with young people in schools to create collaborative community quilts that engage and educate. This quilt, titled Accountability, was created using blocks from a variety of workshops held virtually in 2020. Many community quilts like this one have been displayed at national quilt shows and in art and quilting museums. And in 2020, a series of Social Justice Sewing Academy quilts were exhibited at the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky. These are examples of individual blocks from community quilts. Many blocks combine both powerful, simple visuals and supporting words or text that are embroidered or stitched later on. In this video clip, SJSA's process is detailed, and we will be using a very similar process as we create our own Worsa community quilt.
Hi, my name is Nancy Williams. I work with the Social Justice Sewing Academy, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the process. So all of the blocks that you see here are done by students. So youth are middle school, high school, some younger, some a little bit older. The art is raw edge glued applique. So they go to a workshop, and the workshops could be anywhere from 3 hours to a week to over 6 weeks. Depending upon the venue. But primarily for the community quilts, it's a workshop that's done in 1 day. It starts with a discussion of social justice and what is social justice and what are the types of things when you think about social justice, what do you think about? And then the students then talk about what of that really speaks to them, is part of their life, or things that they're passionate about or concerned about. So they talk about that, and then they get examples of this, but they draw their idea out on paper. Once they do that, they give it to somebody else in the class, and they pressure test the design, which means, when I look at this design, what is it telling me? Does it make sense? Do you understand it? Once that's done, then we give them blocks, and we give them fabric and scissors and glue. And they get to cut out and glue on the fabric what their design is. Part of that process involves an artist statement. So in the artist statement, they identify themselves, but they talk about what this issue is, why they decided on that issue, what does it mean in their life. But also part of it is instructions to embroidery artists who are going to get their block and embroider.
We've spent a lot of time working through the understanding part of art literacy, learning about the conventions, concepts, and basic skill sets of social justice art and quilting. Now we'll move on to the second part of art literacy, participating in that art form in a meaningful, authentic, and personal way. This Wordle was made using the titles of the social justice CTMs created during the past academic year. The Worsa Community Quilt will represent these CTMs and our anti-racist and inclusive values as a textile, and your block will encourage you to explore a topic or idea in new ways. All of us will begin by thinking and writing about what the last 17 months of anti-racism and inclusivity work and our own CTMs taught us. What were you surprised to learn that you didn't know? What made you want to learn more? What images, colors, or words come to mind for these takeaways and questions? Pause this presentation and take a few minutes to jot down your thoughts. As you reflect on this work overall, what are you still thinking about? What can't you shake? What images, colors, or words come to mind for these questions and issues? Again, pause the presentation and jot down your thoughts. Now you can begin sketching, thinking about the images, words, and themes behind what you learned or what you're still thinking about. Don't impose constraints on your creativity here. No idea is too big. Think about colors you associate with your ideas, about size and position of block elements. How can you visually represent your thinking for others to understand clearly and quickly? Once you've sketched a rough draft, begin to formalize your design by using the template found in OneDrive. This template is a 7-inch square, but final blocks may be as large as 12-inch square with a 1/2-inch margin on all 4 sides. Take notes as you sketch for yourself and to pass along to the quilter and embroiderer, me, with your sketch. If there are words you'd like to include, jot them down so you don't forget. Most of the notes you see here that I've included in my sketch are reminders to myself about color. A central part of Social Justice Sewing Academy's model is the artist statement. This is an opportunity to share in writing what your block is about, why this issue is important to you, and what your block communicates about both the topic and its importance. There are two main questions to answer in your artist statement, and both are included on the artist statement document found in OneDrive. First, why is this issue or topic important to you? And second, what elements of your design convey that importance? This is my artist statement draft for the block sketch from a few slides back. My block is about accessibility of visual resources and presentations for people with color blindness and low vision. I won't read this whole page as it will be available on OneDrive, but to summarize it, I became interested in the accessibility of visual materials while taking Michael Duggan's class this summer, and given my continued work with infographics. The choices I have made for my block are intended to simulate color and color palettes for a viewer with color blindness, while also providing examples of colors and design elements to increase accessibility. In the time between now when you watch this and the staff meeting on October 12th, you're invited to sketch a block and draft an artist statement that you can then share with another coach to see if and how effectively your message is landing. Then you'll have the opportunity to translate your work into fabric at a work session during the staff meeting. You bring your ideas and I'll bring all the supplies we'll need. At that work session, we'll create blocks like this one, no sewing required. These blocks, also like this one, will not have any fine detail yet, but anything you want included can be handled in the finishing stage. Carolyn Maslumi said, quote, "Each quilt indispensably enriches us all, has potential to advance the conversation on racism and equality in the United States, and works toward shaping human potential," end quote. As a quilt maker, this deeply resonates with me. I feel enriched by and learn from every quilt I make. I am so looking forward to bringing you all into the quilting fold, as it were, and creating with you on October 12th.